Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the second panel called Liquid Matters. Moving from having dived into the waters to now thinking about how liquid matters matter. We have three presentations, which I won't talk too much about why we brought them together. We can leave that for the discussion. Firstly, Megnaa Mehtaa, who is an environmental anthropologist and a PhD student at the Department of Social Anthropology in the London School of Economics, working on a field site of the Sundarbans in Bangladesh. West Bengal, sorry. You want to use this? Or
I can do that. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm an anthropologist, and actually my research is on sort of political ecology, conservation politics, and I work with the fishing community in the Sundarbans, but the monsoon had so much to do with life in the Sundarbans that even though my research isn't directly related to the monsoons or in fact to embankments, it was really integral to where I was. And so this paper today is sort of an interest from field work, but not really sort of the focus of my PhD. This paper today focuses on the ethical and ecological factors that come to define the politics around embankments in the Sundarbans brackish-water delta of West Bengal, India. In doing so, I attempt to highlight the politics of life itself and open up questions for the relationship between ethnography and design and how design might be attuned to both non-human forces, but also equally to local politics and the geography of inequality. During the time that I did fieldwork, for the first time, a concrete embankment was being constructed in the island where I was based. The Upradhan, or the sort of leading official of the local village government, proudly said to me, and I quote, "This is nothing like you've seen before. This is based on designs from the Netherlands. This is a modern embankment, not like the mud embankments." He spoke at length about the budget, the colossal cost, the dimensions of this massive embankment, which dwarfed the tiny mud houses next to it. He said, and I quote again, "Do you know, in the Netherlands, half their country would sink if they didn't build their embankments. We need to build like them." I was struck by his commentary. It was true that 2/3 of the Netherlands would indeed sink if it wasn't for its dikes. But did the Sundarbans really need to build like the Dutch? What was so modern about these concrete embankments? My first part is just a quick background about my field site. So I conducted long-term ethnographic fieldwork in a village called Bali in the Sundarbans Delta. The Sundarbans, for those of you who don't know, is a mangrove forest, and it is a unique ecosystem. It is the only mangrove habitat in the world with a large number of tigers. And this is why it gets a lot of publicity in the rest of the world for its tigers. But alongside the tigers, there are 52 inhabited islands with a total population of 4.5 million. And that was in the 2011 census, and so it's 4.5 million and growing. Bali Island alone, where I was based, was home to 40,000 people. Demographically, those who live in the Sundarbans belong to the poorest sections of society. The majority are Dalits and Adivasis, lowest castes and indigenous groups of India. And they're all ecologically or political refugees, either refugees of partition or because of floods in other parts of Bengal, which brought them here. So having lost their homes and lands, they came to settle in the Sundarbans in the hope of a new life. The Adivasis, or the indigenous groups here, were brought from eastern parts of India by the British in the 1800s for paddy cultivation. So embankments really are the lifelines of the Sundarbans because the inhabited islands, which are about 52 of them, lie above sea level. And so during high tide, homes and agricultural land would be submerged under saline water if it wasn't for something about 3,500 kilometers of mud embankments. Sometimes they are enforced by bamboo, like I sort of shown in this photograph, but are primarily just made of mud. So this is sort of the embankment that you can see, which is also acts like a path where people walk on, and this is all saline water on the left-hand side, and the forest is right opposite what you can see, and on the right-hand side would be the inhabited village. As Mrityunjay Das and his wife Shanti Das belong to the scheduled caste or a Dalit community, one of the lowest caste communities of India, formerly known as the Untouchables. Mrityunjay and Shanti's household is by the river's edge. They have witnessed several embankment breaches and collapses. As one embankment collapses, the government and irrigation department acquire land to build another. And at the time that I did fieldwork, the fourth ring embankment had collapsed, and in its place, sacks of sand. Sorry, this is Mrityunjay and his wife Shanti, and they're standing on the embankment opposite their house. And I guess when I was there doing fieldwork, the fourth embankment had collapsed, and sort of you can see the bamboo behind. And their land has basically slowly been eaten up by the rivers. And for this particular household, they have no compensation for the land lost and no legal means with which to seek compensation. The cause of the Das family is a case that many millions, not just thousands, are facing in the Sundarbans. For these people, the relationship between death and regeneration, scarcity and abundance, salt water and fresh water, is more stark during the monsoons. The monsoons are the only source of fresh water, and ponds that have been dug to harvest fresh water are used for washing, bathing, and rearing fish. But the months of the monsoon are the months when heavy winds, storms, and cyclones are expected, and the sheer physical force of the rain also changes the shape of the embankments. Roads fall apart, homes and trees are swept away, and you can sort of see during the monsoons, basically as a way of dealing with the erosion, you have sacks of sand that are put out ad hoc as a way of preventing salt water from coming in. And obviously, if salt water comes in, your entire agricultural fields and your homes will be destroyed, and years of labor is just completely in one tidal surge swept away. So very recently, and after a staggering 70 years of India's independence and 35 years of left-front rule in West Bengal, central and state funding have allotted money for more concrete embankments. After decades of destruction, death, colossal and repeated loss of life and assets, there is a realization that with an increase in sea levels and more heightened erosion of coastlines, mud embankments are not strong enough to protect the vulnerable populations of the Sundarbans. The second part of my talk, though, is really about getting to the conservation's backlash against these concrete embankments. So simultaneous to the allotment of funds for stronger embankments, and while some have applauded this commitment to protect the lives of the vulnerable, the region has seen a very strong backlash from environmentalists on the ecological destruction that concrete embankments will cause. And I quote from this is actually in the Hindu, which is a very well-known Indian newspaper, and quoting from one of the head of WWF Sundarbans Climate Adaptation Program, someone called Anurag Danda, and he says in this article that there will be zero flora in the area once you concretize the space. Even birds occupy those portions of the banks which don't get inundated. The article cites the number of species of kingfisher birds who enjoy inhabiting the embankments and who will suffer when it is made concrete. It is this debate between weak mud embankments that leave the population vulnerable and much more concrete, supposedly stronger, supposedly modern embankments that the local government is proud of, but that the environmentalists feel might disrupt bird life, that I want to elaborate further on. But before I elaborate on this, it is important to step back for a moment and go into the land reclamation history of the Sundarbans. So while conservationists today believe that the Sundarbans is home to tigers, crocodiles, snakes, and deer, and is a unique ecosystem of mangroves that should be left alone without human hindrance, this mindset of viewing it as a World Heritage Site, a title it got from UNESCO in 1987, is a new one. Initially, colonial rule considered the entire region as a sodden wasteland, a swamp infested with wild animals and menacing tigers. Slowly, as the vast expanse of the Gangetic Delta was seen as a fertile land, there was a desire to reclaim its lands, but only for revenue generation and paddy cultivation. This was when the vast sort of majority of the labor was brought in by the British from eastern parts of India for generating revenue and for land reclamation. And I suppose the land reclamation of the Sundarbans is a much longer history that I can't go into at the moment. But I suppose it's really important to note that in colonial records, human groups came much after a long list of snakes, mangrove species, fish species, trees and plants, and then there was sort of an insignificant population of human woodcutters that were roaming around the Sundarbans. And this colonial narrative was carried forward in the post-colony and was highlighted actually most strongly in the case of a massacre in Morichapi, one of the Sundarban islands, where primacy was given to the ecology over lower caste East Bengali refugees who were violently shunted away by a police force proclaiming that the island was for the tigers. And I suppose this history I'm only highlighting because today the Sundarban Biosphere Reserve functions on the same principles of fortress conservation, where erstwhile refugees are being further rendered refugees by a lobby of conservationists and the state denying people access to the resources of the region. So the representation of the region as a natural wilderness has huge implications for the way development of the region has been perceived in post-independent India, and explains why even today inhabitants live without hospitals, electricity, access to running water, and of course suitable embankments. It is this development imperative that conceives of this place as suitable for tourists, visitors, botanists, and zoologists, but not for its inhabitants, who are considered to be intruders. In part 3 of this paper, I want to move on to a very particular geography of inequality in the Sundarbans. And as I was living in the neighboring village from where I showed you the first embankment, the sort of concrete embankment with which I began this talk, I saw the construction of it and met families like the Das family that I showed you right from the sort of middle phases of its construction nearing its end. And an important aspect of the geography of the Sundarbans island is that the poorest and economically weakest live on the river's edge. So those who are landed, who own agricultural land, who own shops, and of course also the Pradhan and the Upradhan, the political leaders and the government officials, are all in the interiors of the island. So in an island, the landless live on the peripheries, right by the embankments, and the sort of well-off or relatively more well-off live in the interiors. What happened then with this concrete embankment, as this photograph depicts, is that the communities that live on the river's edge ended up on the wrong side of the embankment, closer to the river and not behind it. So some of them had land and were compensated 1 lakh rupees, which is approximately 1,000 pounds, but this was inefficient amount of money to buy land interior, which is obviously of a higher value for the reasons I've explained and because of the precarity. And the majority were actually landless, and the landless communities work in the Sundarbans forest. They're fishermen, they're crab collectors, honey collectors, and they have no agricultural land. So in our sort of modern embankment, this is the sort of, you can see the parts of the embankment, and the river is behind, and there's a whole colony which has formed, an entire village has come up, which is on the wrong side of the embankment, closer to the river instead of, it's back, okay, closer to the river and not being protected by the embankment. And so the last section, what is so modern about these concrete embankments? From the patterns in history, it is a well-known fact, even to the irrigation department and to the Pradhan, the local village head, that this concrete modern embankment will not be able to withstand cyclones and storms of the region. The most recent cyclone, called Ayla, was in May 2009, and it damaged 500 kilometers of embankments, including areas which had concrete embankments. So Bali Island, where I was based, didn't have concrete embankments, and this was the first one. But this is another photograph of I've taken this photograph from the embankment. The whole colony of landless people have moved on the other side. That's the river in front of you. And I think what strikes me by the comment of the Upradhan, the leader of the sort of local government, is that there's a real resemblance to the British the systems of knowledge, because the British also used knowledge of European riparian systems to build ports and to cultivate paddy, all of which failed because the rivers of the Bay of Bengal Delta, the monsoon, and the cyclonic winds of the region were very different from anything England had ever experienced. Most famously, Port Canning in the Sundarbans, till date named after Lord Canning, who conceived of it, was designed to be a port that rivaled Singapore's port. It was an alternative to Kolkata. Huge expenditure, raw material, and energy went into it, but then the Matla River surged and everything was totally ruined. The British had not understood the rivers of the Delta, which were much more ferocious than they had predicted. So like the colonial period, there is in some ways a denialism even today. Port Canning was built despite many warnings against it and knowing that it would be destroyed. There was then, as is now, this sense that nature can be conquered or kept away through walls. I find another modern embankment there, an image of the colony being on the wrong side of it. And this is actually a photograph of post Isla, where some of these strong, long-lasting embankments have been completely ruined as well, so they don't really serve any more purpose than the mud embankments. And this is a quote from 1875 by Hunter, a colonial administrator who authored the statistical accounts of Bengal. And I think it says something about, well, probably history repeating itself, but I'll read it out. So the inundation works cruel havoc among the low-lying, isolated villages. The grain in their fields is spoiled, their houses are torn away. Liability to cyclones must put a practical limit to the extension of cultivation. And this is key. The more the forest is cleared away, the smaller the barrier placed between the cultivator and the devouring wave. And so there was definitely a knowledge of the fact that clearing the forest for revenue generation and paddy cultivation was a mistake. And yet, of course, reclamation projects were being expanded, and coastlines have been eroded since. And the main motivation has been to generate revenue. And so despite the tragedies that might have befallen inhabitants, forests were cleared at such a speed that the Sundarbans forests were reduced to half their original size. I end this paper with a few open questions that I find unresolved myself. As I sort of said in the introduction, I'm an anthropologist. I'm definitely not an architect or a designer, but I do feel that some of this research comes from an interest in design and its relationship with ethnography. And so in part one, while I kind of highlighted that there's been a narrative of protection in the Sundarbans region, it is a protection that is largely focused on the forest and the tiger and the kingfisher birds, and little thought or energy has been given into the protection of people's lives and assets through the strengthening of embankments, or for that matter, hospitals, roads, or their access to clean drinking water. In the second half, I sort of highlighted that while local government officials like the Pradhan, who was boasting about this modern embankment, are correct in reminding us that certain lives, in his example, those that are saved by Dutch dikes, are deemed more important than other lives, he too fails to notice that in his modern embankment, many of the weakest are rendered the most vulnerable. And lastly, I wanted to highlight that this so-called modern embankment, and the word modern actually was a word that he used repeatedly, the English word modern. The modern embankment, I think, is a well-known fact that in several scholarships and some people sitting in this room, that the state and its infrastructures cannot keep water out, cannot control rivers, and cannot control the monsoons. And they are actually not attuned to the non-human forces at play. And so I borrow, to end this, from some of the recent work well, I guess he's been working on this for a very long time, but some of the recent work of Arturo Escobar on design for the pluriverse, where he argues that design should always be a relational practice. And I quote Escobar, who says, "Design is ontological in that all design-led objects, tools, and even services bring about particular ways of being, knowing, and doing. Therefore, the relationship between design and ethnography is ever more crucial because it is a relationship that can question knowledge systems, ontologies, and projects of the so-called modern. But I would like to highlight that it must also take into consideration two aspects that are usually separated out. And the first is local politics, power relations, ethics, and the geography of poverty or inequality that this paper has tried to highlight. And the second is the forces beyond the human, the monsoons, the surging rivers, the cyclones, tidal surges, and the unbending laws of nature that not even the most modern walls can keep out. So in line with Escobar's work, this paper has tried to open up questions of how we might design for a pluriverse. A pluriverse is an idea of a world in which many worlds would coexist. So ultimately, the ecological and ethical of embankment politics urges one to think of a way in which all lives are valuable and equal, where we allow for people's life projects to flourish and are attuned to the inequalities amongst humans, but also the different forces beyond the human. And just to end, a question for all the designers and architects in this room, but also to work with anthropologists and others, how might we be able to design for a world where no one is on the wrong side of the embankment? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second presentation in this session is from Laura Denning. Laura is an artist and currently a practice-based research in environmental humanities at Bath Spa University. She's currently also part of a residency in collaboration with Mark James Neal, creating work in response to data collected by sensors within waterborne capsules in Aberystwyth. Shall I load this up and just not start it?
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, when you're ready, you just hit space.
I'm quite happy hiding behind the screen. Okay, thank you. Hello everybody, I am not a designer and I'm not a writer, and so I fear my paper will be slightly less scholarly or academic than others that are presented, but I guess that's for you guys to decide. And it also is perhaps a little shorter, so Pushpa, who I believe is going after me, has plenty of opportunity to go over time. So I'm going to show you a short film shortly called Areen and Hewish. Areen is a ditch or canal used to transform areas of wetland into pasture, and it's a term that's very colloquial to Somerset. Some reens are just a few feet long, and the longest is, I think, 27 kilometres long. Hewish is a habitational name that may refer to small areas of woodland and pasture large enough to support a family, and again is a colloquial term unique to Somerset. Through the winter months, the Somerset levels are often shrouded in thick fog and mist. As we know, fog is low-lying, the moisture being generated locally, and the only difference between mist and fog is the degree of visibility or invisibility. The area is also subject, Somerset this is, the area is also subject to severe flooding, both from internal waterways and from coastal flooding. It is unique in the UK for this reason, being essentially our only delta, which barely rises above sea level. During December 2013 and January 2014, many of you will know that heavy rainfall led to extensive flooding of over 600 houses and 17,000 acres of agricultural land. The village of Thorney was abandoned and much Olney was cut off. So Areen and Hewish is a new body of work that I'm working on, which uses the Somerset levels and the Avalon marshes as its focus to explore water in this very specific landscape. And it is intended as a transdisciplinary project. Yes, this area is adjacent to Glastonbury Tor, and yes, in most versions of a certain well-known myth, The mortally wounded hero is transported to the Isle of Avalon in a boat. Of course, the Lady of the Lake might well have been drowning, not waving. And most probably, the Isle of Avalon was in fact Glastonbury Tor, because most probably, before centuries of systematic drainage of the marshes through the creation of the Reens, any upland areas, colloquially known as birtles, would have been islands protruding from submerged marshes for much of the year. Predictions for the future suggest that as a consequence of climate change, this area will once again return to a state of mostly submerged. And for this conference, I've created a short artist film which has been produced on the premise that climate change is altering the landscape irrevocably, and that wetness as a way of being provides a starting point for negotiating life in a changing landscape, or wetscape. I approach this through a series of strategies that offer a provisional scoping in the development of field notes that form the basis of a growing archive of meaning and matter, and some of you will know where I get that term from. The film focuses upon water as vapour or fog, beyond liquidity, as a significant aspect of wetlands ecosystems, and also as a sensuous yet disorientating phenomenon, an effect, if you like. Quoting from Wikipedia, you can tell I'm really scholarly here, the field notes refer to qualitative notes recorded by researchers in the course of field research. The notes are intended as evidence that gives meaning and aids in the understanding of the phenomenon. Field notes are subject to 1, memory, and 2, possibly, the conscious or unconscious bias of the observer. End of quote. Field notes capture immediate data specific to a time and place, and are positioned as provisional and indicative within bigger research projects. They form the initial basis of ongoing inquiry, then later resurface within appendices. They are foundational, yet also marginal. Field notes identify and anchor key trajectories within research. They sketch out a general direction and highlight potential areas where key findings might later be located. Field notes also have an integrity in their own right, precisely because they are subject to memory and subconscious bias. This short film collates material gathered over a 2-month period and presents the appendices not as supplementary materials, but as the material itself, marked by the presence of the observer, whose recording strategy is arbitrary, uneven, and embodied. So I'm using field notes as a series of test spaces for developing material for this archive of meaning and matter, a term coined by Astrid Neymanis in her essay Hydrofeminism, which was referred to in the previous session, in which she states that water is the archive. And I'm going along with that. However, my archive is forward-looking. It's a set of present moments from which we to begin to negotiate a future. This contribution, this iteration in the Rhine and Hewish suite, simply titled Fog, whilst only 5 minutes long, could be described as a form of slow art. There is a focus upon the landscape simply being. There are a series of stranging strategies employed in the editing of the work. This strategy of stranging seeks to exaggerate an intimacy and sensuousness. It uses disruption as a method of embodiment. There are contradictions between the image and the sound, an absence of visual representations of water almost entirely, because the fog occupies the territory within this iteration. There are points where the sound drops out entirely as the film holds its breath, either through fear, anticipation, or submersion, and I'll leave the viewer to decide which. Plus, there is the inclusion of a robotically presented poem written by Carl Sandburg in 1916, which tells of fog in another environment entirely. This disembodied spoken word interjection into the soundtrack hints at the disjunction between policymakers and people on the ground or in the water, and brings to my mind Sarah N. Ahmed's observation that resilience could actually be understood as a requirement to take more pressure. Elsewhere in the film, my own voice presents, amongst other things, the beginnings of a glossary of landscape types a provisional provenance to include in my archive of watery meanings and matters. This film is a punctuation in a year-long project which runs throughout 2018. It started with an accumulation of facts, mostly regarding climate change, topography, and other geographical data. These have been collated into a small reference book, the pages of which were exhibited in February. I then made a filmic sketch, a very short silent film which doesn't have a name, but which added another dimension to my hoard of references, which in itself also includes about 500 photographs to date. A 45-minute sound walk was presented at the Seeing Sound conference very recently at Bath Spa University and is now available on SoundCloud, and a 60-second excerpt from this will be played on a loop throughout Fringe Arts Bath in May and June. This film that I'm about to show you completes the fog section of this extended project, and again the soundtrack draws upon the full-length sound walk. Walking itself marks the next phase of the project, with an ethno-hydro workshop scheduled for May. This will involve bringing together artists, ecologists and scientists for a day's perambulation across the Avalon marshes, sharing conversations around key words. These conversations will be recorded openly but subtly, and the recordings will form the basis of a set of sonic reams. How the project develops after that we shall see. However, the overarching intentions, which include some keywords including hydro, archive, wetness, feminist, will be explored using the combined methodologies of walking, collaborating, and data collection through sound and image, all leading towards the collation of a first chapter in a provisional archive of meaning and matter. Much later in the year, I will experiment with these strategies during the monsoon season in Bangalore, and then again during winter in the Arctic Circle. Before entering my final year as a practice-based student, and I'll have to really get down to some work then, I guess. In the meantime, here it is. I guess it's that button. Yes. Those at sea get a warning, but on the ladders the fog descends without a fanfare. Based on the dry islands of the marshes and the adjoining hills, early man exploited the resources of the wetland which lay between them. This was a changing landscape of open water, reed swamp, wet woodland, and raised bog. However, these wet landscapes were difficult to cross, so wooden trackways were built, the most famous of which is the Sweet Track.
finally, for this session, Pushpa Arabindoo is a URIAS Fellow 2017-2018 at the Paris Institute of Advanced Studies and a Senior Lecturer in Geography and Urban Design within the Department of Geography at the University College London and co-director of the UCL Urban Lab. She's an architect and holds a PhD in planning from the London School of Economics and an MS in urban design from the Pratt Institute.
Thank you. Do you want to put the Westminster slide on?
That would be good, I think. You want to put that to me?
Because I have my notes here. And this works. Cool. Okay, so this session is turning out to be an experimental session in presentation mode. So you had Megnaa showing her wonderful photographic images from her fieldwork. You had Laura's our artistic video, and then I'm going to test your endurance to pay attention by going for a completely PowerPoint-free presentation, and also my ability to maybe capture your attention. Partially the reason why this is PowerPoint free is because what I'm going to talk about is related to my current work that I'm doing in Paris as a URIAS Fellow, which is to try and write a monograph on Chennai, pulling together a lot of material that I've been researching in this city, in the southern Indian city, since 2003, 2004. And my reluctance in kind of giving a PowerPoint presentation or putting together a visually appealing presentation is mainly because this is a chapter that is yet to be written. So it's very sketchy, and what I'm presenting here is the kind of initial ideas of what would go into this chapter, and so I'm really using you as a testing ground for some of the arguments. So bear with me if it's kind of very skeleton-y, frameworky ideas, but I look forward to your comments. Thank you, Laura, for conceding some bonus time, but I think because it's such a work in progress, I will probably pass the bonus time to the keynote speakers who would be coming after me. So maybe they have better use of the extra minutes that you have passed on over. So amongst the several weather-related jokes that Chennai often suffers from, one of the most popular is the frequent lament that the city is known only for 2 seasons, 9 months of hot weather and 3 hotter months, even though climatology textbooks will assert that the city indeed has 4 seasons like almost any other place, 4 being the key word here. It's a very European construction of seasons, that every place has 4 seasons. And if you look at these Western departures, Aboriginal communities in Australia, for instance, talk about 7 seasons. So climatology textbooks insist that Chennai has 4 seasons, a cool dry, hot dry, and 2 spells of rainy seasons, southwest monsoons and northeast monsoons. Its tropical location at 13 degrees north of the equator means that there is not a massive diurnal range in its temperature. Maximum is supposed to be around 36 degrees, but anybody who's been to Chennai in the last few years can very easily assert that it can go up to 40. 36 is kind of like an ideal temperature nowadays, and a minimum of 24. Accompanying an acknowledgement of this perpetual heat-like conditions is, however, an assumption that the city, due to its hovering temperatures, equally suffers from a related dryness, resulting frequently in drought or near-drought situations. This, however, is not quite the truth. Its average annual rainfall of 1,300 millimeters is comparable to that of comparable to that of New York, and it's nearly twice that of Delhi, and surprisingly that of London, both of which register only around 600 millimeters of rainfall in a year. And yet it has managed to acquire the dubious tag of water scarcity capital in the world, and that this scarcity has little to do with the actual amount of rainfall and much more related to water management strategies is of course an obvious argument that is staring us in the eye. This notion of water scarcity is also a construct that has been dehistoricized and naturalized through a process of political manipulation that relies little on common sense. So at the risk of a rather reductivist analysis, what I'm going to do as a starting point for this talk is to suggest that the shift in creating a political legitimacy through water from an emphasis on abundance to that of scarcity can be primarily attributed to the colonial regime. This is a very simplistic argument, and you can go back into the pre-colonial eras to similarly talk about how abundance and scarcity has been alternatively and simultaneously used to construct different kinds of water-related imaginations for political legitimacy. But during the colonial era, it was carried to a level of exaggeration that we have records, and it kind of has echoes in the current day context. So early accounts of colonial settlers talk about water as very scarce, ignoring the area's well-cultivated pre-colonial hydrological landscape. And what they did by talking about water being very scarce in the colonial settlement was a way of fostering a hydraulic manipulation based initially on digging wells. So in Fort St. George, where the early British traders settled, a lot of it was based on well-based supplies, and funnily enough and strangely enough, it was already privatized at that point. There are documents that talks about giving contracts and awarding the supply of water to private contractors. And it eventually led to, when a colonial administration was put in place, it eventually led to the setting up of a engineered supply system. This approach, I argue, stems from the lack of reading water as a seasonal element, instead thinking of it as a resource that needs to be available perennially. Thus, even though a few early travelers and settlers remarked on the existing system of reservoirs and irrigation feeding a fertile hinterland, most of the beginnings of early Madras as a colonial port city echoed concerns of a settlement that was parched and faced scarcity of water supply to the European settlement. And just a small clarification, Chennai and Madras are the same. Madras was a name used for several centuries before the name was changed to Chennai in 1996. As a process of political agenda of vernacularization and decolonization. So this tone of scarcity dominated much of colonial planning in the city, where amidst a very skewed water supply and distribution system, when one was put in place, much of the city was expected to serve itself through individual wells. Thus, the idea of relying on groundwater for meeting the city's water demands dates back to a time period much earlier than the reckless extraction that came to mark post-colonial urban development. This was supported by a deliberate British reading of weather in the Indian subcontinent, where hot and dry in terms of temperature became a normative climatic discourse. And there is several historic climatology records which shows the colonial reading of Indian summers as being consistently dry, suffering from heat, etc., etc. Even though Chennai has probably had 7 recognized drought years in the colonial administration documents, several intermediate years were often described as with near drought conditions where the monsoons repeatedly failed. These narratives were used to justify whatever decisions the colonial administration made in terms of subsequent water management plans, and it essentially emphasized the unreliability of rain-fed surface water resources to favor a hydraulic manipulation of these sources alongside what the colonial administration considered as a more reliable groundwater to sustain the city and its growth. So one of the initial arguments that I'm exploring in this chapter is that while the practice of reading water and weather in tandem is not uncommon, it requires an urgent rethink challenging this constrained meteorological framings whereby water is not reduced to the lens of a technological fix, but it's kind of reinstated as an element of nature, one that is based on the rhythm of a more natural seasonal imaginary. Here I draw on Jody Berlin's recommendation to read weather as a mediation between the physical and the social, one that cuts across the spatial and the temporal, and what she refers to as a culture of weather. And extending her argument, I ask, what does this approach mean for a simultaneous reading of water? So if we are going to read water and weather in tandem, can we do it through a socio-cultural construction and analysis? It of course requires rethinking what we know as a meteorological practice or meteorological reading of weather. And this is it's not something new, because there is a established argument that calls for ethnometeorological study of our interactions with weather. But what makes it particularly relevant in the case of the monsoons is that these kind of meteorological readings are not as scientific as we would like them to be, or as we assume them to be, and they are steeped as much in myths as in fact. And these myths are generated not by just an everyday reading of the weather, but more a preference for the dramatic. So the emphasis is often on the extreme and the unprecedented. And this notion of the unprecedented is something that I have already explored when I did an analysis of the Chennai floods in 2016, and I've talked about it very much as a construct, as a false construct. So scholars have for some time thus used this notion of ethnometeorological study of our interactions with weather based on insights about nature, culture, and identity. There are risks attached to this proposition as we kind of rescript nature as a cosmos, and it sounds a bit bordering and fringing on a kind of cosmological imagination which has its own disadvantages, relying on populist narratives that might not be entirely true or helpful. But what might be a good starting point is to rethink this hubris of a meteorological language that we currently use, one that is a curious mix of science and metaphor. At the same time, there is still some usefulness to this scientific jargon, where instead of the polarized binaries that we are kind of getting used to, such as drought and floods, weather is seen as a more discursive expression of wetness and dryness. There's a kind of a continuum between wetness and dryness that you lose when you start talking about drought and floods. And this is what makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because when you attend conferences that are dominated by climatologists, meteorologists, or even like the National Institute of Disaster Management in India, many of the experts tend to talk about drought and floods, and even though they acknowledge it as two sides of the same coin, the fact remains that it initiates an imagination that is based on a polarized binary rather than helping us to think in terms of continuum. And in that sense, there is some advantage to persisting with the meteorological language, where you can think in terms of wetness and dryness. The monsoon's seen as a condition of extending from a spectrum of wet to dry conditions. It suggests that one possible way of a more ethnographic approach to meteorology in this context is through recasting this notion of atmosphere. And within geography at the moment, and within urban studies, there is an emerging argument or discourse around this idea of urban atmospheres. And in using the term atmospheres, it draws on a discourse of affect and emotions, which is very common, which is very popular within geography. But it thinks it proposes atmosphere in the particular context of climatic studies, not as an abstraction of that space above ground, but one that is continuously conditioned by socio-physical practices of an everyday urban life world. So here, when you talk about the atmosphere, I'm not talking about something that's purely a physical autonomous system of particles, currents, and fronts, but a more material and tangible expression involving a complex interaction between air, water, and soil. For instance, I tested this approach in a design studio charrette that I ran at a private school of architecture in Chennai last summer, where final year architecture students undertook to unravel a major infrastructure project in the peri-urban part of the city, the Outer Ring Road, in terms of its ecological ramifications. The Outer Ring Road is quite an interesting project because it's about 60 kilometers of a ring road that is being constructed from major industrial investments in the southwest part of the city, connecting them all and providing them easy access to the port in the northeastern part of the city. And this 60 kilometers of road infrastructure cuts across wetlands, water bodies, forest scrublands, all kinds of a sensitive ecosystem which has been destroyed and damaged. And to a large extent, the 2016 floods was pretty much blamed on the Outer Ring Road interfering with the natural floodplain of the city that was located in the southwestern part of the of Chennai itself. But in this studio, what I wanted to focus on was really not simply, pronouncing the Outer Ring Road as an unmitigated ecological disaster. That's quite an easy argument to arrive at, and many environmental activists had already done that. But what I wanted the students to do was really to use the a very complex vocabulary drawing from architecture, meteorology, engineering, social sciences, and across different disciplines, to disaggregate the project in terms of what it means for specific natural and man-made elements. So in this case, we looked at 6 features: air, water, soil, vegetation, food, and waste. And then I had the students tracing all along the Outer Ring Road a disrupted circulation of, they chose bees, for instance. They superimposed a corridor of pollination over the Outer Ring Road. They explored how the monotony of an infrastructure project erased a more complex soil ecology, producing a rich and heterogeneous plant environment which was completely compromised by the project, so on and so forth. And they came up with very interesting findings in terms of waste economies that existed along the villages that were disconnected and disrupted by this infrastructure project. And one of the things that looking at the Outer Ring Road through this kind of vocabulary made me realize is that how little attention we pay to the notion of temporality when it comes to urban studies or urban analysis, which is very much fixated with the spatial. And so using this notion of temporality, what I'm trying to do in this chapter on tracing Chennai's hydropolitics is to reconsider whether this idea of looking at weather and water in tandem could be done through the lens of temporality and through a reconsideration of monsoons through a renewed seasonal imaginary, one that emphasizes a construct that might kind of risk bordering on a whimsical reading. I have my own reservations about doing this, and I'm working this kind of seasonal imaginary out in my head at the moment, because what is happening is that when you try to look for cultural references of seasons, it means a reliance on rituals, many of which may have faded or become irrelevant in modern day contemporary life, as they're based often on agrarian practices and significances such as harvest. And then you think you have to reconsider what these rituals mean in an urban life world. So they, thinking of a seasonal reimagination in terms of festivals, rituals, and other kinds of cultural practices equally can be mythic and disturbingly folkloric in the urban context. And so then the risk is you're producing another notion of weather as a lore. It has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. So here I cannot help but ask if we are over-romanticizing the subject of everyday readings of natural science. So, when people start talking about the color of the sky, the direction of the wind, the behavior of animals and sounds, etc., one that is more proverbial than anything else. And then there's, clear cliches and stereotypes when we say that, there are certain communities that read weather better than other communities which tend to be ignorant about some of these readings. But yet there are new interpretations of monsoon-related rituals that are present in the city, such as the Adiperukku festival, which has been kind of reformatted as the Amman festivals, and it's related to rural-urban migration of subaltern communities, and it takes place very prominently in the city in the month of July and August, and it's related to flooding of the southwest monsoons, and it's a practice that was very prominent in the rural hinterland, and how it makes a reappearance in the city itself is something that reveals new directions for alternative narratives. But celebrated without a context could pose questions and challenges, and this is something that I am thinking through at the moment. And yet scientists have, and if you talk to any of the meteorologists or weathermen, the so-called local weathermen who are in Chennai, they themselves would be the first to acknowledge that this kind of traditional observation of natural science can produce good predictions that are almost as reliable as modern meteorological forecasting. So it's very often that when you listen to the Indian meteorologists on TV or on radio, they cite from traditional texts, they cite anecdotes from history, a lot of them cite from Thirukkural, which is this very classic Tamil text, and so you wonder whether the awkward binaries that some of us have alluded and referred to in the earlier sessions about environmental knowledge as being either traditional or modern, scientific or non-scientific, actually works in the Indian context. It's overcome in very odd and discomforting ways. But maybe by overcoming this awkwardness, we can recover meteorology from being purely a mathematical science to a more analytical one that can accommodate some of these mundane understandings and readings of weather. There is also the potential here of this within this temporal reimagination of seasons. One that what we need to remind ourselves is that we need to avoid some of these cliches of how we reckon with time. Linear was cyclical is something that's very classically been referred to within anthropological discourses, or even solely based on something that's driven by a calendar-based understanding of time. And so anthropologists such as Tim Ingold have talked about interpreting season as rhythms occurring in the context of both the short and long duration. And here I find this particularly useful in this kind of temporal interpretation of seasons, particularly in understanding of monsoons, because it's based not on any kind of boundedness, repetition, or pattern, but one that unfolds continuously as a recurring phenomenon. So there's a back and forth element to this where the decisions made in terms of everyday practices, say in one season, is clearly informed by what happens or has happened in another season. So there is a subjectivity to this approach where, and I hesitate, but I'm using the term seasonality here, and I know that earlier there was some discussion in the when you had the meeting in the morning about this, whether seasonality is an appropriate analytical framing. But I do think that this notion of seasonality rather than seasons as an experience is important, because what you're stressing here is something that is not repetitive, and what we witness one year will not be repeated in another year, but it also equally stresses the need to think of one season through another. So for instance, in the case of Chennai, what has been happening is that most of the time we think of the failure of the northeast monsoons in reference to the failure of failure or success of the northeast monsoon in the preceding years, instead of thinking of it in relation to how the southwest monsoons performed in the same year, or how the summer months had progressed in the same year. So this kind of intersectionality of seasons within the same year is lost against the way we set up these very rigid references of, you compare northeast monsoons with northeast monsoons instead of addressing it in relation to a larger seasonal cycle. So And it creates a false sense of expectations in terms of its record and performance. And so then we generate the fact that this year the monsoons were dismal, or it was below standard or below record levels, which means that in the last few years we have continuously had a discourse of the monsoons as a failure rather than as something that might have been average, sufficient, or something else. So this reimagination of weather based not on seasons as entity, but as seasonality triggers a representation of the urban. And this is where I kind of go back to my urban studies background, and this is something that I have been, again, trying to flesh out in this chapter, is this notion of the urban as a landscape. And here, again, I rely on Tim Ingold, who refers to landscape as kind of a seasonal taskscape. And so what he says here is that you have a distinction not between land and nature or land and water, and this is a distinction that's not very concrete. And so his provocation is that landscape is neither land nor nature nor space, and it's purely based on a spatiotemporal imagination with a greater emphasis on time. I find this particularly intriguing as a possibility in the context of Chennai, where, or any Indian city or cities around the world, where most of the time when we try to think in terms of the ramifications of weather, we have this tricky aspect of what do you do with the floodplains. Floodplains are neither land nor water, but they need some kind of a classification system which draws from the rigid land use planning regulations and toolkits, and it's almost impossible to classify them as water or natural features because of the intense contestation and competition for land as speculation. So in that instance, this kind of extended imagination of the urban as a landscape offers some possibilities, but again, it's an imagination that has a lot of challenges in the way real estate politics and speculative politics plays out in the Indian city. So I admit that I'm being somewhat naive here when I'm thinking of a new kind of urban imagination here, and the possibilities are probably much reduced, but at least it's worth exploring. So in terms of kind of a few concluding thoughts, what I'd like to remind ourselves is that for most part of the 20th century, a majority of the official approaches to Chennai's hydropolitics had been based on an abstract normativity generated by the confidence of a meteorological science that privileged kind of statistical reading of weather. So as a result, the production of water was constructed through a sense of an average, average rainfall, average water supply, and everything is constructed around, we need 600 MCDs of water a day, and everything is very numeric. It provided a socio-natural interpretation that is nowhere close to reality, and this has paralleled an urbanization whose spatial dynamics has left much to be desired, of course. And thus, while the chapter that I'm working on attempts a possible rereading of the monsoons as an ecological phenomenon that draws from the potential of a socio-cultural reading, using a seasonal imaginary that emphasizes the mapping of the city or the urban as a landscape through the prioritization of the temporal becomes a possible structuring element of a life world that can kind of find reconciliations between these distinctions that we are all grappling with, nature-culture distinctions. In the end, I'm kind of going back to one of my favorite French philosophers, Henri Lefebvre, who's also written extensively on this notion of rhythmscape. And as somebody who had published the production of space and talked about space being a social construct, socio-political construct, and a construction of capital, I found it very intriguing that towards the later part of his years, he returned back to a sense of time, and he talked about urbanization, and he remarked upon it as a kind of a rhythmscape. And so this notion of rhythm introduces possibilities of bringing water and weather back into the urban question when it comes to tackling urban challenges in cities like Chennai, and that's something that I'm trying to still explore through this chapter. So there you go, you have a kind of an idea, a seed of what I'm trying and struggling to do with, so open to a lot of questions. Thank you.
Especially for me, this dynamism of these water-saturated landscapes or life world, and the fact that we're never at the poles or the averages, we're always just changing in between. Are there any questions from the floor, or do I get to start? I get to start, great. Laura, I actually wanted to ask about a scene, an image in the film, which kind of struck me. There was the second image, so after the fog there was this picture of the levels, and everything was soaked from the air right down to the matter in the ground. But in the middle of it there was this horizon line which was kind of shifted like a slash through the image, and I was just wondering where that came from in this kind of flat landscape of the horizon, reading in that way.
I don't think the landscape is entirely flat, I guess. No, it isn't. I mean, the more I traverse that landscape, the more complex it becomes. And so I don't think it's because the landscape, I don't think that the landscape is flat. Also, there are ways of shooting material that, just move the camera slightly, don't you? So that's where that one comes from.
This question's for Megnaa. I was really struck that you talked about the relationship between ethnography and design, and I think that's a really important emerging strand of theory across the design disciplines in many ways. And I think what it's pushing against is also some of what we saw in your presentation a little bit later as well, is that the state has a tendency towards simplifying and legibilizing, at least the modern state does, and that's so clear when you look, for example, at James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, that you know, when you impose those forms onto the landscape of understanding, that they really bear no relation to ethnography or to topography. Then there's a sort of simplifying narrative also that comes from real estate, which is this purely sort of financializing, or the commodification of landscapes and landscape spaces as imageable, consumable, sort of rarefied, deracinated objects in and of themselves. So I think I lost the framing of the question there. But I'm just curious whether you have comments about that emergence of ethnography and design as perhaps a way of countering those very powerful simplifying narratives.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and I think I mean, one of the things for me why ethnography is so interesting is that it actually complicates even things like community and the collective. And so it's very easy, and most of the times the Sundarbans and these islands are considered as homogeneous, so the Sundarbans people. And actually, really, if you end up being in a particular place for a very long time, you realize that there is no such thing. And so this is drawing on somebody else's work on embankments, which I also looked at in sort of researching today's presentation. But Dr. Amitesh Mukhopadhyay, who's in Jadavpur University in Calcutta, writes about actually how the breaches of embankments really help people whose livelihoods are supported by the irrigation department to then repair them. And so there's this tension within a community of people who benefit from embankment breaches. And there's this really interesting thing where ethnography and design then are just further complicated, because there are people that are constantly losing out, and there are people who are gaining from the others losing out. And so I think it is ways of thinking. I mean, I think ethnography can definitely benefit design, but I would also say that design should be thought of and incorporated in ethnography, and that doesn't happen usually because we're either ethnographers or we're designers, and then some of us are obviously trying to do both, and I guess that's my interest in bringing those two together, but just thought-wise, I don't actually do that, so yeah.
Can I just clarify that when you showed your pictures of the embankment, I didn't read it as a design intervention because it had PWD clearly written on it. PWD is the Public Works Department, so it's very much the public engineer's intervention, and it has very little to do with architecture or design. And so I was actually curious as to whether you had small architecture studios doing, alternative studio projects to show that there are other possibilities of rethinking these embankments. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about what we construe as design, because many of these are engineering solutions, engineering and planning solutions that have very little room for architecture or design here.
Some of the interesting examples are actually coming from the Dutch, who you spoke, in a way against. But in fact, the Dutch are working with soft defenses beyond the dikes now, which, those kind of hybrid solutions could be possibilities in India.
I mean, I think, so I'm definitely not an expert in embankment design or architecture or in Dutch embankments, but I think what I will say is that I think that divorcing of design from architecture is also probably problematic, and so that if we don't think of engineers and architects, even of the government, as they are designers, and ultimately that, shaping our landscapes in any form or way is a politics of design. And so I wouldn't say that design is just in a studio of architects and in universities, and then engineers and builders on the ground in the government are in some ways not. But I think you're right to bring up the Dutch again, because the example of the local the head of the sort of government official who was there with the irrigation department showing off the modern embankment was using the Dutch in this kind of grand wall building. But actually the Dutch are probably doing something way more interesting, which is on the ground, thinking about their local context, which is not happening in the Sundarbans. We're not really thinking about the ecology of the Sundarbans in relationship to the landscape. We're thinking of, or at least in this particular case, thinking of how we can learn from certain other colonial structures in the past or right now, say in Netherlands. And so, yeah, just...
I just can't help entering this. In fact, Megnaa, in some ways you answered what I was wanting to say, Pushpa, when you sort of said that engineers are not designers. I think that's the big mistake whether we are landscape architects really make. And, for years when, we've been looking at the Mississippi, and we really think of the engineers as the designers of this landscape. And if we do that, then it actually empowers us to think more fundamentally about design. And so what's happening is because landscape architects and architects don't think of the engineering work as design, when we are called on the table, we do the decorative work. So we do nature-based systems, and we are just asked to come and do the fluff and the greening of these dikes. But the fact that that line has been drawn and that's a design decision is really quite significant. So in some ways, I couldn't help, I think we cannot divorce that, and I think there is design that we have to enter that arena. And I think that to some extent you were asking Megnaa that, and what I was thinking, Megnaa, was that I was fascinated by your presentation, and to some extent maybe we'll hold back till we present, because we do think about things you're talking about, and we do think about what design could be in these landscapes. But I think if you expanded design to your field, and I think you're right in saying how designers tend to think of themselves as ethnographers, but ethnographers don't think of themselves as designers. If you again if you push the definition of design and thought that the way you frame things, the way ethnographers look at things, is actually already design. So if you look back at some of the presentations made, that ways of seeing our design, in some ways without actually designing the embankment or not, you are designers of this landscape. So I think if you take that added responsibility, it opens up a whole other world.
If I can just add one point actually to the gentleman's observation actually on the Dutch, and the move now to actually nature-based thickenings actually of the line with natural systems. And what you showed actually very powerfully in that image actually where the poor actually are outside and we notice them, they become the first line of defense actually against any disaster. And to see them that way, is to really, I think in some sense look, at this being an analogy actually for colonization of the last 500 years, wherein, this has actually been, it sort of encapsulates actually who these people are actually, who take the blunt actually of capitalism and of colonial capitalism in some way.
Any further questions? Right at the back there.
Just to pick up on that idea of how ethnography could inform design and so on, I was wondering if in these communities that you studied, if there are clues of alternative approaches to this relationship to the waters, to this quite misleading, I guess, animosity between the so-called natural reserve or the island as a natural reserve versus the people and citizens and so on. I'm not asking this in the sense of design studios, but in the sense of the actual communities that live there. If they have come up with innovative ways that involve material approaches, tectonic in fact approaches.
Is that directed to me? Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think just before I'll have to think about that one further, but one of the things that is really crucial to say is that I tried to sort of bring up in the presentation is that the region really has a very deep and fundamental ideological split. So, and I was trying to bring that out and there wasn't enough time, and it's important to say that there are just a lot of people who think that the way to develop this region is to take people out of it, and it's sort of this deep ecology perspective where it's supposed to be for the tiger, it's supposed to be this ecosystem which is unique. And then, of course, there are other people who will say that, well, now there are people there, there's a certain historical reason for why people are there. Should they continue to live without electricity, hospitals, and embankments? So I'm sort of going on a roundabout way to answer your question, but the reason I think why some of this thought has not been given more thought, or some of these alternatives haven't been given more thought, and also to your question, is that there's just a real split into whether we should think about communities living there in a sustained way. And I think a lot of people have a backlash, and even for me, the shock was that if you're critiquing the embankment, critique it on other grounds, not that it's only going to hurt the birds. I mean, personally, I said, of course, birds, but also there are human beings living there. And so I think there's a real ideological divide, and people don't talk to one another in this divide. And whether there are alternatives, I think there are alternatives, which I actually don't, as I didn't research embankments. That wasn't the sort of focus of my PhD. I don't know those alternatives. There might be some, but I think it's what ends up happening is that the kind of right now the levels of erosion in terms of climate change and sea levels rising are so dramatic, and infrastructurally, I think there needs to be definitely a sort of meeting of outside state and non-state help from people living there, which is not happening. So maybe, I haven't answered your question as to the alternatives. I'm sure there are some, but I also, I'm not an expert to comment on what there might be in terms of resisting the forces that are actually quite strong. Yeah.
I think one thing you said in your presentation, this idea of just allowing lives to flourish as maybe a principle, seemed really powerful, and that would mean human lives, plant life, animal life, all kinds of materials, but it also probably means that things change. Right? It doesn't mean that they stay the same. Any more contributions?
Hi. This question is both to a bit Megnaa and Pushpa. Coming from Tamil Nadu and really familiar with what you're talking. For a long time, politics in Tamil Nadu is about welfare state, which is that the state should be seen as finding demonstrative, quick solutions to a lot of problem. Has been, or how does it shape this reading of water? Because to a large extent, how do you draw a water body in a map is something that I've always wondered, because it's never constant. Sometimes it's never there, and sometimes it's beyond something. So how do you read that when you talk about politics of water in a state? That is always where that is always a debate. And to Megnaa, the idea of embankments, I was also wondering that why the people live in the delta, and whether their living is related to this vagaries of monsoon and how the water itself fluctuates. Is it related to their life? Is that why they are there in the first place? So whether to put them on one side of the embankment or the other side of an embankment, is it only a question of flood risk?
Okay, I think I briefly alluded to this nature of the paternalistic state and the way it reads weather and water simultaneously in a very specific meteorological construct, which is this binary of drought and floods. So, the paternalistic state can come and provide relief against drought or relief against floods. And that very much determines the way they seek for solutions around water. So the last scheme from the previous regime of Jayalalitha, when she released these 1 rupee water bottles, was a way of encountering the state's response to water crisis, making water available as a commodity. So there are several levels of, technopopulism that deals with the way we respond to water as a scarce element. And so it's a bit more complex than what I'm able to answer here, but I kind of alluded to briefly, and that's something I explore in the chapter, this notion of technopopulism rather than a techno-scientific or a techno-engineering solution. So the idea that a populism is very much rooted in techno-scientific solutions comes with it. So otherwise, why do we draw water 200 kilometers away from Viranam, which is completely unsustainable to maintain a city that is not even a major source of wood bank for the state of Tamil Nadu, the government of Tamil Nadu. So it's a little bit more complex in terms of the range of solutions, but it is related to the idea of a paternalistic state for sure.
So, yeah, thank you for your question. So the reason why the people live in the Sundarbans is, I mean, it's very simple, but it's actually, they don't have a choice. I mean, it's one of the most inhospitable places for anybody to have lived historically. And these are largely ecological refugees from other parts of West Bengal that were flooded, that in the beginning of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 1900s, came there in search of lands or because of partition history. So they're refugees from East Pakistan, and then actually the first sort of wave when it became inhabited was brought in by the British for paddy cultivation. So Adivasis were brought from the Chota Nagpur plateau to work as laborers, to cut the forests and to grow rice. So these are the people that are living there, are very much there, not necessarily out of their own choice, but out of a lot of historical, political, ecological factors, and they are the poorest and the weakest, arguably, in India. But they have to be behind the embankment because it's a brackish-water. I mean, it's the Bay of Bengal Delta, so it's salt water. So the minute and it's twice daily tides, so it's the high tide and the low tide, and the entire region would be underwater if it weren't for these embankments. And so, I mean, there's no way, these inhabited islands that have been cleared were forests once. They're now, people are living there, and the embankments are the only ways to allow for agriculture, for homes, for any sort of life form to grow without saline water. So, yeah, they're quite necessary.
We could take one more question, Pamela?
Megnaa, I was wondering whether fertility of the delta had any significant role in people cultivating paddy in that region. So.
Yeah, no, I think so. I had to really rush through the historical kind of land reclamation history, but there was this constant. It was a wasteland initially, and then of course it was thought of as really.
Sorry, again, who classified it as a wasteland?
So the British colonial administrators initially. I mean, there was the large tracts of the Sundarbans were given out to zamindars who owned them initially, but there wasn't sort of paddy cultivation as such. And before that, it has a very long history that goes back to sort of the 11th century, where a lot of actually Sufi. There were Sufi movements, and there's been arguments where agricultural extension and Sufism were very linked together in this region. So it has a very old history, and I started the presentation today from the colonial period where they thought of it as a wasteland, but then they decided that we should exploit it. So once they realized that it was actually quite lucrative, and so there has been this relationship between the Gangetic Delta as being fertile, and obviously now it's a World Heritage Site for different reasons than the British thought of it.
So probably go to Pushpa as well, because in Chennai also a lot of these water bodies or the wetlands were classified as wastelands, which were like particularly meant for acting as a sponge for holding water during the rainy season and then recharging the groundwater in the to be available in the summer season. So right now I feel that in Chennai they are trying to set up a wetland authority which would take care of these wetlands in that manner, if you're looking at that as well.
I think we've got two more questions before we break. Pamela here and then David at the back. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you for the three very rich presentations. I'm not sure if mine's a question or a comment, but I was taking Pushpa's idea of the ethnography of the atmosphere, which I think we need to think more about, which I think is really productive, and linking water and weather, which then led me to Laura's paper, and I was thinking about the ways in which fog and mist, as sort of, if we could push them more as analytic categories, and the kinds of, and it raised the issue for me around the vocabularies we use for certain kinds of weather phenomena as being very cultural. I can't think of anyone describing the monsoons using fog or mist, those terms with it. And so what that does for the kind of work we're doing. And again, to go back to this idea of ethnography as design, I think we need to think more carefully about that in terms of the terms. So I don't know, Laura, if you want to take up the ideas of fog and mist, because in your abstract you had said that the difference between them is visibility, and it made me think.
Yeah, sure, as far as I understand.
No, I was just wondering, because I don't actually know.
I know of nothing about the monsoon, though this time next year I might do better informed. And so I don't know whether the monsoon includes the experience of fog and mist. I would love to know. But I find that, you know, to think about a wetter world is to think about all the categories of that wetness, which again is why I'm choosing to go to the Arctic as well. It's actually quite dry, but there's snow underground, which is obviously made of water. And so, given that my whole research project focuses on water in the broadest possible sense, I want to explore that. So that's my interest in it. But I think you're right, shifting the terms is really important. And I suppose I wanted to pick up on something that I got from what you were saying, which is that the more colloquial or subjective narratives that talk to us, or talk to science, if you like, are important. You know, they have a place within our broader understanding and shouldn't be sort of shoved under the carpet as ignorant and primitive, if you like.
No, but also in terms of fog and mist, just a quick clarification, at least in the Tamil geography, pani, which is used for fog and mist, is actually a winter phenomenon. It's not a monsoon phenomenon, but I don't know how it is in Delhi or maybe North India, but it varies very quickly. This climatic metaphors, they vary very, very quickly in terms of localized geography. So we have to be a little bit careful about standardizing them as well, or kind of taking them out of context and putting them somewhere else.
I guess that's why I'm interested in using words like reen, hewish, Bertel.
Exactly, I really loved it, because I want to go back and look into the etymology of these terms as well, because they will reveal a much richer narrative that's rooted in the geography of the area as well.
Indeed, yeah.
One more, David?
Yeah, just to follow up on the previous question about atmospheres as being a space, a social space or a climatic space, let's say. I wanted to ask about the methods you use to everybody, the methods you use, the visual methods you use to display your ethnography or your design or your art as research, and also notions of fieldwork. It was an interesting point that you all raised around fieldwork and how that interlinks between different types of practitioners. I wonder if you could elaborate more on that, please.
Okay. For me, it's really at a experimental stage. So I discovered a lot of possibilities when I did this design studio with this architecture students last summer. So when I talked about them, documenting air along the outer ring road, they did very interesting things, and it was not scientifically accurate at all. But for one section of the road, one group of students working on the theme of air calculated the particulate matter, and also at the same time calculated the amount of pollens. So they were looking at pollination versus pollution, and at different times of the day and different times of the week they were looking at the ratio of pollens versus the particulate matter as a way of understanding air as a polluted space, but at the same time air as a nature and as productive space in terms of creation. So, some of these are rough and ready methods, and they might not be scientifically accurate, but it was very powerful in the context of the image that they evoked. And so, they relied on collages, photomontages, and other kinds of mapping exercises, which was useful in conveying a message. So for this chapter particularly, I've been looking at a lot of historical archives. I'm particularly interested in the mapping exercises that was done for Chennai in the 18th century. And a lot of these cartographers mapped the natural spaces first before they were mapping the settlements, and that itself is very interesting. And I'm looking at some of the correspondences that go into why they chose, and they call them as the environs very broadly. And what do they mean by this category of environs? What are the natural elements they chose to map, and what are the ones that they chose not to map? And so that's what I have been looking at for the purpose of this chapter in terms of archival material. I'm also working with the photographer who has a grant to do a photo essay for this chapter. He's a French photographer based in Paris, and he's been coming and documenting some of these spaces in the contemporary context. And so the idea is that we can kind of juxtapose these old archival maps against the current day photographs. So it's pretty much kind of the tried and tested formula and rough and ready, but I think they can be powerful enough to accompany the text that will go into the book.
My answer is I exhibit in my work in galleries, online, in conferences such as this. I've got same with my sound work, so I've got Mixcloud and SoundCloud accounts, and increasingly it's through collaboration and engagement with people. So, for instance, in September of last year, I held a silent disco in the sea, in which the participants, 100 of them, stood in a tidal pool and listened to an hour-long curated piece of underwater animal sounds. I guess they're animals. So that would be one way in which I'm doing it. I'm now developing a piece which hopefully will involve a large choir of people using British Sign Language, so it's anti-sound, essentially. Anyway, I can get my hands on, really. I use my mobile phone for pretty much everything I do, and I think I do that perhaps in the sense that, for the same reasons that I'm interested in colloquial terms for particular places. I want it to be about real people, real places. I want it to be grounded or saturated, depending on the context, rather than using technologies and vocabularies which are rarefied and inaccessible to the majority. That's my answer.
Yeah, no, in terms of methodology, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and so I do field work, and I wish, actually, just hearing from both of your responses in your work, one of the interests of coming to this conference was really to think about multidisciplinary and multi-visual and multimedia collaborations, because I think that's really powerful. And so even though my methodology is just the kind of participant observation living, I spent 20 months living in the Sundarbans, I would have really enjoyed to have visual media accompany, and if I would have really liked to have made a film, and also cartography and spatial understandings, none of which I had. But I think the interest is in to try and sort of get out of just anthropology and think of design and other ways of sharing one's work. Yeah.
Do you have a final question?
Oh, I was interested, Pushpa, in what you were saying about rhythms, and thinking of it not in terms of season, but sort of and other ways of kind of calendrical cycles and imaginations of time. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little more on how one can do that, because I was also very attuned to the fact that there were so many rhythms that punctuated, whether it was the monsoon or but it was hard to be able to think of it as a pattern. So how do you think of it not as seasons, but also rhythm with a pattern?
Yeah, I think for that we need to look at how we live our everyday lives as well. And in a certain sense, there is this binary of, man and nature. So our everyday life cycles are quite set in particular rhythms and particular recurrences. And then you have the nature's own rhythm, and they overlap and they also diverge. They converge and they diverge. And so I think we need to record as much the humanistic side of the rhythmscape as much as we think in terms of the natural side of things. So that's what I'm trying to work out in my head. To be honest, the notion of rhythm is something that appeals to me theoretically and conceptually, but I think pragmatically, in terms of an analytical tool, it still seems to be quite abstract. So I'm working through the material. And so, and you have so many different schools of interpretation. So I started with rhythm from, as an urban studies scholar, Henri Lefebvre is my source of reference. And so I started with his work, but then I discovered this whole body of anthropological references to rhythm, mainly Tim Ingold, which is very different. It's on the other side of the spectrum. So the question then is, do you take a little bit of what they are offering and just kind of cobble them together, or do it's a matter of convenience technique? I don't know. I'm still working it out. But the idea is that there is, it does have a spatial correlation, and you cannot think of it only in temporal aspects. So that's the tension that I'm working with at the moment in terms of understanding Chennai's rhythmscape.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for a wonderful discussion. We're going to take another break now. I want to draw everyone's attention to this side of the room where we have an exhibition set up featuring work by some of the people presenting, as well as some other people who are here and some other people who are not here. If you turn to the middle spread of your booklets, there's biographies for everybody who's not presenting. So take some time to look at the exhibition. There may be something left at the back if you rummage around in the table. And the keynote presentation will be at 6:30, which is half an hour. Okay. So thank you again to all the speakers.